3 years before he walked on the moon, Neil Armstrong was spinning toward death in a capsule no one could save from the ground. He had seconds before he blacked out. Gemini 8 was supposed to be a clean, controlled test. On March 16, 1966, at 11:41 a.m. Eastern, the Titan II rocket lit up Launch Complex 19. Two men, Neil Armstrong, age 35, and David Scott, age 33, strapped into a capsule barely the size of a small car and were launched into orbit 160 miles above Earth. Both were rookies in space, but Armstrong had already flown the X-15 to the edge of the atmosphere. Scott was a West Point graduate with nerves to match. Their orders were clear: dock with the uncrewed Agena target vehicle, codenamed GATV 5003, already circling the planet at 17,500 miles per hour. This was not a stunt. Docking in orbit was the one thing Apollo absolutely needed to pull off for a moon landing. If two ships could not lock together, no lunar module could ever return home. The plan was to close in, lock the probe and drogue mechanism, and test the connection. After docking, Scott would step outside for a spacewalk, just the second American to do it. Then a series of precision maneuvers would prove that astronauts could steer, undock, and re-enter with pinpoint accuracy. The flight plan was built for perfection. Simulators had drilled Armstrong and Scott through every possible failure except the one that would actually happen. 6 hours and 33 minutes after launch, Gemini 8 would make history. 27 minutes later, the first sign of disaster would appear. But on launch morning, it looked like nothing could go wrong. Armstrong and Scott were about to become the first humans to dock two spacecraft in orbit, and the whole world was watching for a quiet triumph. 6 hours and 33 minutes after launch, Gemini 8 made contact with the Agena target vehicle. Armstrong guided the capsule in, inch by inch, matching speed with a machine flying at 17,500 miles per hour. The probe and drogue mechanism clicked. Hard latches engaged. For the first time in history, two crewed spacecraft were physically locked together in orbit, 160 miles above the Pacific. Armstrong's voice came over the radio. "We're docked." Mission Control exhaled. This was the proof NASA needed. The docking wasn't just theory. The hardware worked. Two ships really could join in orbit and hold, the way Apollo would need to if anyone ever hoped to come back from the moon. For Armstrong and Scott, it was a moment of total control. The checklist ticked down. Electrical connections checked, attitude thrusters tested, the combined spacecraft stable. The world's first space docking held fast for 27 minutes. No spinning, no tumbling, no hint of danger. Scott prepared his suit for a spacewalk. Armstrong ran through the next maneuvers, voice steady, hands exact. In those minutes, Gemini 8 was the clean success NASA had built for. The crew delivered the outcome everyone wanted: flawless, mechanical, routine. 27 minutes of perfection, with the man who would walk on the moon at the controls. Then, almost without warning, everything started to slip. 27 minutes after docking, the world's first joined spacecraft began to roll. The movement was slight at first, a slow drift, just enough for David Scott to notice his instruments twitch. Then the roll picked up speed. Armstrong's hands moved to the controls. He radioed Mission Control, his voice steady. He said something was wrong. The immediate suspect was the Agena, the uncrewed target vehicle. It made sense. The two ships were locked together, and if one started spinning, the other would follow. Mission Control agreed. The working theory was that the Agena's thrusters had stuck open, pushing both vehicles into a slow, unwanted turn. Armstrong made the call. He ordered undocking, separating Gemini from the Agena to isolate the problem. The clamps released. For a breath, it seemed like the crisis might end. But the moment the two ships parted, the spin did not stop. It exploded. Freed from the Agena's mass, Gemini 8 began tumbling violently, rolling at a rate that no simulator had ever dared to model. The capsule spun up to nearly 1 revolution per second, 60 revolutions per minute, fast enough to gray out a fighter pilot and threaten blackout. At this speed, blood pools in the limbs, the brain starves for oxygen, tunnel vision closes in. Armstrong's vision began to gray out. Both men's heart rates soared above 180 beats per minute. Scott's voice crackled over the radio. "We have serious problems here. We're tumbling, end over end." With blackout closing in, Armstrong did something almost unthinkable. He reached for the switches that controlled the main maneuvering thrusters, the OAMS, and shut the entire system down. The spin didn't stop. He had one option left: the re-entry control system, the RCS. A separate set of thrusters mounted on the nose, reserved for bringing them home alive. Firing those in orbit was against every rule NASA had written. The fuel meant to bring them home would be spent just to stop spinning. He flipped the switch. The RCS thrusters fired. For a few seconds, the capsule shuddered, then slowed. The world steadied. The spin dropped from 60 revolutions per minute to 0. Armstrong and Scott were alive, stabilized, with barely enough fuel left for re-entry. The man who would walk on the moon had saved both their lives with seconds to spare. 3/4 of the re-entry fuel meant to bring them home, burned away in seconds, just to stop the tumbling. That was the cost of survival. NASA's rules were clear. Once the re-entry control system was fired in orbit, the mission was over. There would be no spacewalk. David Scott's chance to step outside vanished. The plan for 3 days in orbit collapsed to just over 10 hours. Armstrong and Scott were ordered to abort immediately, forced into an emergency descent. Gemini 8 splashed down in the Pacific, 500 miles east of Okinawa. It was the only Gemini mission to end in these waters. No press ships waited. The world's first space docking ended in silence, far from the headlines. The destroyer, USS Leonard F. Mason, was already on station. Navy crew pulled Armstrong and Scott from the capsule, barely a few miles from their planned recovery point, remarkable accuracy for a mission spinning out of control less than an hour before. Everyone survived. Armstrong rarely spoke about what happened above the Pacific. Apollo's triumph would bury the story. But the calm, rule-breaking decision that saved Gemini 8 is still cited by those who chose him to command Apollo 11. In March 2026, a new set of photos, shot by Ron McQueenie, a soldier on the Mason, surfaced at the Armstrong Air and Space Museum. They show Armstrong and Scott on the deck, alive, unsmiling, the capsule behind them. The man who would walk on the moon came seconds from blackout, and the moon landing came within seconds of dying in a spin. Today, every mission still rides the line between triumph and blackout. The fuel meant to bring them home was gone in minutes, burned just to stop the spin. No one could save them from the ground. The moon landing came within seconds of dying in a spin.